All right. That was. Uh, I had a brain fart. Oh wait, come ye sinners, and this is RC Apologist, and welcome to Theological Discussion. I am your host, RC Apologist, tuning in for another Thursday, and we are going to indeed be having a good time for today. Hopefully, anyways. I mean, we're trying to do our best in light of the whole self-quarantine thing. Everyone's been having their ways of trying to deal with the whole thing. I've been trying to drive myself insane, but that's another story for another day. But yes, I hope everyone is doing safe, that you all are following y'all's procedures, social distancing, and everything. Because the more you actually listen and obey these instructions, the sooner we can try to get this whole thing taken care of. So, that being said, thank y'all for tuning in, and with me, as usual, is the candy corn doggo himself, the dog made out of sugar, aka, according to the mug that is on his cup, number one. Good boy, it is the man, the legend, Ave Nova himself.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to RC Apologist. I hope everyone out there is doing well in these dark times, staying safe and healthy and all that, and look forward to a great show.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Now, normally I would say that I had like some G Fuel on me, and I don't have it this time because I got a shipment of the cans in, and I already drank the last of the can, which contains 300 milligrams of caffeine, so it's a bang energy drink at that point, but the focus is still in there for a bit, and I also have my delicious, what is this? Honey, and, well, it's got honey in it, but it's a lemon ginger herbal tea, so that'll be good for the digestion, as well as to help soothe and calm me down as we go over today's episode. But I do like the fact that everyone's managed to, join in and want to contribute, so thank y'all for tuning in. And also, I see we got Chris from Dolos, I think that's how you say it, Doulos or Dolos Theology, in the live chat. What's up, Chris? Or at least that's what I'm assuming. It says Chris dropping in. So let's go over today's topic. Hold up first. I'm going to because there is someone that's even trying to ask this simple question, and it's a good question to ask, and we're going to get into it. But as y'all see in the chat, we are going over talking presuppositional apologetics. That is the name of the episode. Also, why we are slowly being more, or at least myself anyways, not sure about Ave on the matter, but slowly starting to become convinced more of this particular method. And here's why. So let's first of all go over what presuppositional apologetics is. Now, presuppositional apologetics, for some of y'all that need a history lesson on this, was a methodology of apologetics that was developed by Cornelius van Til. Cornelius van Til, who was a Dutch American Christian philosopher. He was born in the Netherlands, and then ended up moving to America, where then that's where he would start receiving and getting his higher education. And he was well trained, or being taught the scriptures by his family, and then of course he would go get the higher seminary education, and then eventually he would get to 1 year being spent at Calvin Theological Seminary, where he would be studied under Louis Berkhoff, who was a great theologian. But then he goes over to Princeton Theological Seminary and gets his PhD from there. And as soon as the liberal tendencies start to creep in over at Princeton, that's when he would then start to teach and he founded, first of all, co-founded, and decided to teach over at Westminster Theological Seminary, where he taught for at least according to this Wikipedia article here, 43 years of his life. And while doing this whole thing, he developed what is known as the presuppositional apologetic methodology. Now, of course, he would be what I would say is formalizing it. I say that people from back then, they would have, like, for example, the Apostle Paul, I think, utilizes the presuppositional method of apologetics quite a bit, and so does some of the other New Testament figures. But that being said, so we have Cornelius Van Til, who essentially does this and also develops what should be known as the transcendental argument, which essentially, to put it in a perspective, let me go ahead and go to this website to offer what is a summarized version of it. But essentially, the presuppositional apologetic method tries to argue that the Christian worldview is the only way that you have to be consistent with that you argue from the Christian perspective of things, argue from the Christian worldview. And that part of this includes then the transcendental argument, which includes that, and I'm going to define these for you, by the way, before we get into the lettering, that, for example, for P to be the case, for the preconditions of intelligibility, that is, logic, moral values, the uniformity of nature, several other things that could be defined under this category. In order for these things to be the case, Q, that is, the existence of the Christian God, would have to be the case, because Q is a precondition of P, and P is the case, therefore Q is the case. Another example of this is, for there to be a carpet laid, which is P, there must be a floor, which is Q, to have it. There is a carpet laid, therefore there is a floor. This would be considered, according to the article, a narrow ontological argument type. Now, we're going to try to make this as simple as we can, because some people aren't, and this is where it also gets interesting, because a lot of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because there are people lately that have been going against it. One person that we know for sure that is not a fan of the presuppositional apologetic method is the guy who goes by the name of Cameron from Capturing Christianity. Now, he has invited a philosopher to try to go against it, and I think the main reason why he goes against it is because, and during this whole apologetics tournament thing that was going on, a philosopher, Michael Ramstein or whatever his name is, ended up losing to Side 10 Bergenkate, who is a presuppositionalist, though I have problems with his particular methodology in how he tries to do presuppositional apologetics. But everyone was upset and says, wow, everyone lost, or this high skill philosopher lost to someone who used a stupid methodology called presuppositionalism. Presup sucks. And so Cameron tried to use this as sort of a damage control to essentially try to get people to vote for him, even though it didn't necessarily prevail, if I recall correctly, by the end of it. But people were upset that the dude was losing in the whole thing. And this is where it became an issue where people needed to look into it a bit more, and I started to look into it a bit more. And as a result, I came away thinking, definitely a lot more biblical approaches at it. It definitely does seem so, because here's the thing. What it tries to argue for some of the part, and that is, I gave Abe some articles from Gregg Bahnson that sort of focuses on this, but what essentially, one of the main things that starts off with, and we're going to get into the Bible software right here, so let me pull this up. If you go to Romans chapter 1, we start in verse 18, and we read the following here. Hold up, it's lagging a bit. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. So what we're seeing here is, okay, God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold, now it's talking about these men that are being ungodly and are unrighteous, who hold the truth, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The word that is used for the holding the truth and suppressing the truth word there, that is basically, they are purposely and intentionally holding back that knowledge and suppressing it in their hearts. They know it is true, but they choose to suppress that. Because why? Because of their unrighteousness. And we see this elsewhere in 1 John as well. And then we see that because because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. That means us too. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. We are without excuse in terms of, the debate of does God exist. We are without an excuse in knowing God exists. But, as it goes in verse 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible men, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. So ultimately, we're getting into the theology of it here, where basically people know God exists, and either they have a different idol that they create, hence the false religions out there. Even atheism could have some of this if you find and focus on what is the particular thing that the atheist will substitute for that. Some people may say themselves that they are gods. Some people may try to subscribe some attributes that belong to God, but give it to some part of creation or something that does the creating, that they would say. So we have those particular things here to keep in mind about the theology of presuppositional apologetics at the root. Now, while we have that, then you have the issue of, okay, if this is the case, then why do debates? Why get into apologetics with the atheist? Because the issue is this, that in order for the atheist to make certain statements or to even engage in certain things, they must utilize the worldview of the Christian faith. They must utilize the Christian worldview. So in other words...
But how could they do that, though, if they're atheists? Right? Like, they have to...
Well, and here's why. We'll start off with an example here. Let's play a little bit of some devil's advocate here from you, Ave. Just pretend to be the atheist in this sense. So you got to try to convince me, let's say you start off saying that it is immoral for parents to teach Christianity to their children. Let's start off with that one.
Oh, go! I would never say that. What the heck?
I know. This is why we're doing devil's advocate. Devil's advocate being that you're just gonna,
all right, fine.
pretend to argue from that.
That's my position, right? I think it's we should keep religion out of schools. I think it's immoral. You're forcing your beliefs on children. How about that?
So why is it wrong to have it pushed upon children?
Well, because I don't. This is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I guess because school should be separate from religion, and maybe parents should teach their religion instead of it being in the public schools. Yeah, I'll say that.
So why is it okay for the parents but not the teachers? What's the difference?
Because you go to school to learn about like math and reading.
Okay.
Not about someone's religion, and maybe everyone doesn't believe the same thing.
Is it wrong? Is that an objective wrong? Is it a morally wrong objectively? Or is it only subjective, meaning just your opinion?
I mean, I guess in this case, it would be subjective. That's my opinion.
So if it's just simply subjective and it's just your opinion, then someone else has an opinion. And would you say it's wrong to try to force your opinions on somebody?
Well, yeah.
So wouldn't that be the case that you're trying to force your opinion on somebody here, since you're saying that the idea of teaching religion in school is immoral, and that's your opinion, and you're trying to force that on other people? So would you say you're contradicting yourself?
Or no. In fact, I could say that it's your opinion that it is moral to teach kids religion in school, and in fact, you're forcing the religion upon them by doing so.
Okay.
Aha!
And so why is it ultimately wrong?
I don't know.
So ultimately, what happens is that you test and ask questions, which is one thing that are being what is usually said by some of the presuppositionalists, is that you ask the questions, and then ultimately you try to get to the foundation of the worldview that this person may have. So when it comes to the issues of them saying that this is wrong, and you ask them, is it objective or subjective, and you try to get them to, if they say subjective, you try to get them on it and see if they can be committed to it. And they'll say it's subjective, but they live like it is objective. For example, and we're going to play a clip here where this method gets utilized while I was in Arkansas. Now, the audio may not be clear at the beginning, but just so you get a bit of a context, I was out helping this guy street preach and witness to some people, and this guy comes up saying that it's wrong to force your opinions on somebody. I want you to listen carefully to how the atheist reacts here in this scenario. All right, so let's let this play.
Exactly. Nobody gonna know though, because nobody lived back then. That's what I'm saying. Nobody can know though. Nobody has. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. That's what you believe. No, that's what you read in the book, and that's what you think. So what about Josephus? That's what you think. That's what you read in the book. What about Josephus and Tacitus? That's what you. I don't really know what you're talking about. Well, then can I explain? You read that in the book. I read something else. That doesn't make my right or your right wrong. It doesn't. So would you say that right and wrong is subjective, not objective? Say what? Is right or wrong subjective or objective? Subjective. So if it's subjective, that's subjective.
So notice what I said there. I asked, is right or wrong subjective or objective? He says subjective. So at that point I said, okay, if it's subjective, then is your answer subjective? And he said yes. So meaning it's just his opinion that his definition of that is right or wrong. So in other words, that it's just an opinion that right or wrong is an opinion. Can you wrap your mind around that?
That's rather meta, but I can kind of see it.
It is reducing it to absurdity regarding the issue regarding his worldview. But that's only the first part. Listen to what happens next when we get into the issue about rape. And notice that whenever he says what he says, there's a woman behind him who eventually turns her head and looks at him with a weird look as soon as he gave one answer and starts to, as I call the video, how to make an atheist do a complete 180.
It doesn't matter about beliefs. It doesn't matter about beliefs. I can say that I can disagree with that. Doesn't exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So what he's saying. Listen. What he's saying is that his truths are the only right thing in the world. Because that, I'm not done. His truths are the only thing right in the world. That's what I'm saying. That's what he's saying as well. Because I don't believe what he believes in, I'm wrong. That's what he's saying. But nobody knows what really happened. That's why there's so many different books about it. There's so many different beliefs. Right. Just because you believe it doesn't mean somebody that read the Quran doesn't believe it. Right. That's what I'm saying. That's your truth, and that's their truth. Leave it at that. That's a different category. Leave it at that. Stop trying to force somebody else. Stop trying to force your beliefs on somebody else. That's what I'm saying.
Would you say that it's immoral and wrong to force our idea that rape is wrong on the rapist?
But to the rapist, it's not wrong. That's what I'm saying. It depends on what type of person you are.
So that should mean that we shouldn't force our ideas and put him in jail, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that.
Notice that?
Whoop.
Let me play that again so make sure everyone knows what was just said.
Not wrong. That's what I'm saying. It depends on what type of person you are.
So that should mean that we shouldn't force our ideas and put him in jail, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that.
He was about to say yes. He was about to almost be consistent, but then rational thought took over. Reasonable thought took over. And his conscience and him deciding, okay, time to borrow from the Christian worldview. No. It is not wrong to force the ideas and put the rapist in jail because of rape being wrong. So he says it's wrong to force your beliefs and your ideas on somebody. And he even agrees and said to the rapist it's not wrong to rape. But that means we should then force our ideas onto someone who doesn't share those ideas. So again, he is reducing his own worldview to absurdity, and as a result, what he does as a result is borrow from Christianity, the Christian worldview, which treats this as an objective evil. And it's not just a mere opinion, because when people say things that rape is wrong, they don't say, in my opinion, rape is wrong. You'll always hear, rape is wrong, no qualifiers, which can only make sense of a statement if Christianity is true. So, that is one example of the method being utilized. Now, and there's a reason that video is old, and it says in this, I'm just now dabbling in it here in this episode. But the reason I'm saying this is now because that when I'm looking at some of these other methods, they aren't ultimately getting into some of the big issues. And ultimately, apparently, when I was reading the book Always Ready by Gregg Bahnson, and I sent Ave a copy of that, I had been doing presuppositional apologetics in its fullness this entire time, at least according to Gregg Bahnson. I wasn't even aware of it. But there are other things that I'm needing to learn more, such as certain philosophical rules of logic and debate laws. So that would be something that I think is quite interesting to look into. But the more I start to read it, the more I'm trying to wonder, in light of all this, how is it that some of this material is out there? And not only that, that there are people that are proposing and explaining these ideas, like Revealed Apologetics, Eli Ayala, Dulles Theology, I know, is had a recent debate where he was utilizing presuppositional apologetic method on that. And then you have modern people like John Frame and K. Scott Oliphant, two of whom were students of Cornelius Van Til, like Gregg Bahnson. And I have John Frame's Systematic Theology, and then I have K. Scott Oliphant's Covenantal Apologetics. These are materials that are out there, but when you see a critic, we're not talking about an atheist, we're talking about Christians. They say things that have been addressed and answered already in these books, in the material. But it's as if they define it in some ways that are just ridiculous. And I don't know, I mean, and I wasn't going to go over it for this part, but we're going to try to show an example of where this kind of goes wrong. So for some people that y'all may be familiar with it, there was a video done by, as we mentioned, Capturing Christianity, where he brought on Dr. Richard Howe. I forget which seminary he teaches at, but he did a video called A Sound Refutation of Presuppositionalism. So this is how you really know that he is just trying to find material that he can make a just some kind of claim. And personally, I think at this point it's for attention. But what's interesting is this, that he tries to bring up, and this is where I know it's from both of them, because he tries to bring up it's like Muslims can use this argument too, right? So let me go ahead and see if I can get to the part of the video where that happens here. Let me just fast forward, make sure we're at the right part. Alright, so here, and I want y'all to listen, and then I'm going to read an article from Apologetics Central that goes over this thing here. And by the way, before we do that, see Dulles Theology. Oh, first of all, let's go to Tony Hinshaw's thing. Is it wrong to start a fight in church over some silly opinion? If it's a silly opinion, yes. So it would again have to depend on what exactly the opinion is. Dulles Theology, who is the presuppositionalist I mentioned, says the critics consistently refuse to engage with the source materials. The one exception to that is the critics from Ligonier Ministries. They are our friends, and I appreciate their criticism. So yes, I've actually seen, because even before he died, a while back. It was a R.C. Sproul. He was a critic and even debated Gregg Bahnson on this topic. But they at least engage with the primary sources and the materials that actually teach this stuff. Whereas these people we're about to show today, they don't know what they're talking about. So let's go ahead and play this particular video here.
Of Jesus being God in flesh.
So I think one of the difficulties that presuppositionalism faces in particular is how to engage someone of another faith, like a Muslim apologist or something like that, because you can't have necessarily the assumption of Christianity there if you're talking with a Muslim, right?
Well,
so how does that work?
No, it's funny.
Doesn't really have any problem with the classical approach, right?
Well, it's funny. No, it doesn't. And it's funny. I was actually in a conversation with a presuppositionalist, and right in midstream, because I thought, well, I'm not really making any headway. I'm not really very persuasive here. So I just switched, and I began to argue as a presuppositionalist Muslim. And everything this Christian said to me, I said, the problem is you're not presupposing the self-authenticating, infallible word of the Quran. That's your problem. You're not submitting yourself to the authoritative precondition of honor, however you want to say it, and used all the language that I could think of the presuppositionalist, except saying Christian or saying Bible, I said Muslim and I said Quran. And in order to try to get him to see that as far as the template of what you're doing, it can adjudicate different religions, each of which might make the same presuppositional authoritarian claims.
This is
So, and that really like nearly made me push the brakes on in the car when I was driving and listening to that, because I'm like, really? Because it's obvious that even these people aren't aware of some of these other things that are out there. Like there's and it's in the Free Christian resources link in the page, but I'll see if I can find a way to access it from here, so that way y'all can get the link in the live chat. But there is a thesis, his dissertation entitled "Addressing Muslim Objections Using the Presuppositional Model of Apologetics Can Be Defended on Historical, Biblical, and Practical Grounds." And so I'm going to leave that in the live chat. But this is a, let me see here, about a 100...
Wait, so I'm sorry, about the person who was speaking before.
Yeah.
So he's basically arguing against it. You know, that hey, Muslims can do this too, and it's really the same thing.
Right.
Or is there a different way of applying this to Christianity that there's no other religion can do that?
Well, there's a reason why it's just simply this. That it's for Christianity, because even as the author of the Apologetic Central argument, which is Joshua Pillows, he states in commenting on this particular thing, and I'm seeing this saying that YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. So I don't know. Hopefully that everything goes well on people's ends. I hope y'all can hear us at least. But he says Islam can use this. He says this later in the video. Cameron brings up a quote further difficulty that presuppositionalism faces, namely that a Muslim can use the same argument. And then it goes on to say, with all due respect to our brother in Christ, Dr. Howe, this is just embarrassing. This one quote alone proves either that Dr. Howe is lying when he says he's read presuppositional literature, including Bahnson, which I don't think and I hope isn't the case, or that he has never read presuppositional literature with a genuinely open mind or clear understanding of what's going on. This criticism is married to the other alleged defunct aspect of presuppositionalism, which is committing oneself to fideism. If we're allowed to arbitrarily pick a worldview and pick a and argue in a circular fashion to defend it, then there is no knowledge to be had after all, right? The simplest and most straightforward refutation to this point, or to this, is to point out why he, as a Muslim presuppositionalist, is arguing that the Quran is self-authenticating and attesting. Where does it say that? You see, the basis for the Christian making the argument about the Bible is precisely because of the fact that the Bible says so in the New Testament. Should Howe have ever argued in this fashion to a well-learned presuppositionalist, his argument would have been taken apart in seconds. He could have perhaps gone to Exodus 3:14, where God attests to his own authority. But how then do we know that all of the Quran came by his authority? The Christian's answer to the Bible's veracity lies in Paul's words to Timothy, where he states that all Scripture is quite literally breathed out by God, 2 Timothy 3:16. This is further substantiated by Peter's words about Paul when he likens Paul's letters to Scriptures, 2 Peter 3, verse 15 through 16. Where do we see this type of self-authentication in the pages of the Quran? And I'm going to go ahead and give you that answer. The answer is you don't. And I have a Quran, and I've seen that, and that's why I don't really see presuppositionalism as a thing in the world of Islam. They're more so going to argue like the classical apologists these days. And there's another article, and we're going to kind of quote the portion of it, but it's from an essay called Presuppositional Reasoning with False Faiths by Gregg Bahnson. And he has a couple of paragraphs dedicated to Islam, because he says, in some people's minds, it is the Muslim faith, however, which presents a threat to presuppositional apologetics, because where one reflects on Islam's Unitarianism, fatalism, moral concepts, lack of redemption, etc. Islam can be internally critiqued on its own presuppositions. Take an obvious example. The Quran acknowledges the words of Moses, David, and Jesus to be the words of prophets sent by Allah, in which case the Quran may be, on its own terms, refuted because of its contradictions with early revelation. And then it mentions the sophisticated theologies offered by Muslim scholars interpret theology of the Quran, which is Surah 42, Ayah 11, as teaching the transcendence, tanzi, of unchanging Allah in such an extreme fashion that no human language derived from changing experience can positively and appropriately describe Allah, in which case the Quran rules out what the Quran claims to be. So you have a refutation of Islam that is done by Gregg Bahnson and by other presuppositionalists, that even when they say, oh, we could use this, no, you can't, because your worldview is not consistent enough. And hence comes to the problem. But
yeah, I could definitely.
Yeah. What were you gonna say?
I can definitely see them take a classical approach.
Mm-hmm. And so, why then should we, the Christian, go for presuppositional at this point? Well, here's where I think the advantage would come in at. If one goes with the if one's going in for a presuppositional method, then ultimately, number one, it is going at it, wanting to be faithful to the word, and that you're prepared and you know your theology well enough to defend it. And ultimately, while you do give the answers to why you believe what you believe, because remember, that is, after all, why we do apologetics. If you go to 1 Peter, let me go there, chapter 3, verse 15, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, which that's the attitude of the apologist, to sanctify the Lord God in your heart. Make sure that in your approach that God, the Christian God, is Lord in your hearts, and that he is the center of your apologetic method. And be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So meaning that if someone asks, why do you believe God did this? I give the answer. If someone asks, why do you believe God would allow this? I give the answer. Why do you believe Jesus was crucified or needed to be crucified? I give the answer. So we give an answer to every man that asks a reason of the hope that is in you. So we have that, and we do that. But at the same time, we must also render what is being stated by the non-believer and give them basically what is described by Gregg Bahnson as a sort of 1-2 step procedure. So here we have in Proverbs chapter 26, where this is sort of found. And even this is utilized by Gregg in his book Tactics, which I recommend anyone to get. We have the following, which may seem like a contradiction at first, by the way. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. But at the same time, the next verse says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. So you have here two verses. One says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. Then the other one says, answer a fool according to his folly. The first one to explain is that do not answer him according to his folly. In other words, don't answer him by taking upon his presuppositions. In other words, don't assume atheism or anything that's not Christianity for the sake of argument. Because if you do, then it says, lest thou also be like unto him, be like a fool at that point. So don't be like a fool unless you want to be that way. So that's why it says don't answer in accordance with his ways. In other words, that you take up and adopt those. But at the same time, it then says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. So what it's saying is to basically give out an explanation of his worldview, why his worldview would fail. In other words, okay, let's test your theory, let's test your idea and bring it to its logical conclusion so that it is reduced to absurdity. In fact, in the John Gill commentary, it says the targum of this verse is, speak with a fool in thy wisdom. In other words, using your wisdom, speak to the fool. And then the Syriac, yea, speak with a fool according to thy wisdom, which would at once remove the seeming contradiction in these words to the former. But then they are not a true version. Indeed, it is right and must be the sense that when a fool is answered, as it is sometimes necessary, he should, that it be done in wisdom, and so as to expose his folly. He is to be answered and not answered according to different times. So in other words, there's a time to answer him, and there's according to the folly, and a time not to. And in this case, what you're just simply doing is saying, okay, if atheism was true, if subjective moral values are true, you're giving a logical experience, a test drive of this worldview. That is what we're seeing, of which you can then compare the atheist worldview during an approach to then bring up, okay, now what does the Christian worldview offer? So ultimately, for example, in dealing with the problem of evil, for example, the problem of evil says that, if there is a God that is all loving, and there is a God who is all powerful. If God is all loving, then he would remove evil. If evil exists, therefore God is not all loving. And if God cannot remove the evil, like some people will try to say, that if he can't remove evil, then this means God is not all-powerful, because then that limits his abilities. So this is the argument that is usually put forth, and what is ultimately being brought up in Bahnson's book, and it can even be accessed in an article which I will give the link to in the chat via the Covenant Media Foundation, but it's a portion of Gregg Bahnson's Always Ready book. And
I really don't like that argument about God.
Oh, yeah.
When people say, "Oh, well, if God is so loving, why do bad things happen?" It's like, well, God can't eradicate evil from the world because sin exists, right?
Oh yeah.
It's called, like humans do that. Like, oh my God, I can't every time.
By the way, that's some good tea I just drank. But anyways, so he talks about that people, that evil exists indeed, that it is a thing in the world. But here is what's very interesting. In a section that's entitled, "For Whom is Evil Logically a Problem?" in the chapter, the issue is, like, hold up, let me actually, because I'm trying to make sure that I get to the main argument here, and I want to make sure I get, because I was just funny enough, I was just reading this, and I don't want to misrepresented or get on the wrong side of things when going over this. So, all right, so let's see. Okay. Alright, I'm just going to have to make sure I don't mess this up. But essentially, let's go just already to the section I meant. And I'm going to have to zoom in a bit as well because it's kind of hard to read on the article section. But for whom is evil... We lost Ave. And I was wondering if that's the thing. Is there a... Hold up, let me add him to the stream. Are you there?
Sorry about that. Hit the wrong button.
I was about to say if there was a connection thing or anything. All right.
No.
So the premise is, of course, God is completely good, God is completely powerful, and then there's the fact of evil exists. These are all premises that the Christian and the atheist can agree on. Now, here's the quote from Bahnson. Accordingly, it is cruel to the unbeliever's case against Christianity to be in a position to assert that there is evil in the world, to point to something and have the right to evaluate it as an instance of evil. If it should be the case that nothing evil exists or ever happens, that is, when people initially believe what people initially believe to be evil cannot reasonably be deemed evil, then there is nothing inconsistent with the Christian theology which requires an answer. So, there is the issue of, as it's stated, that if it should be the case that nothing evil exists or ever happens, that is, what people initially believe to be evil cannot reasonably be deemed evil, then there is nothing inconsistent with Christian theology which requires an answer. But what does the believer mean by good? Or by what standard does the unbeliever determine what counts as good so that evil is accordingly defined or identified? What are the presuppositions, that is, the... and in fact, that's what I'll go into, because a lot of people like to think when they see presupposition, that means, oh, it's an assumption. And not necessarily. There's actually, even on the website frame-poithris, a Cornelius Van Til, a Van Tillian dictionary. And it's basically, or glossary, should I say. And it basically defines terms that he has used, because sometimes he used these philosophical languages and it was very hard to understand what was being said by him. But presupposition, as defined in the glossary, is, quote, a belief that precedes other beliefs, a belief that governs other beliefs. Ultimate presupposition, the belief that governs all other beliefs, or the most fundamental commitment of the heart. So that's what's usually meant by presupposition, and Bahnson would carry that over as well. What are the presuppositions in terms of which the unbeliever makes any moral judgments whatsoever? Perhaps the unbeliever takes good to be whatever evokes public approval. However, on that basis, the statement, the vast majority of the community heartily approved of and willingly joined in the evil deed, could never make sense. The fact that a large number of people feel a certain way does not, or should not, rationally convince anybody that this feeling about the goodness or evil of something is correct. Ethics does not reduce to statistics. After all, ordinarily people think of the goodness of something as evoking their approval, rather than their approval constituting its goodness. Even unbelievers talk and act as though there are personal traits, actions, or things which possess the property of goodness or evil, irrespective of the attitudes or beliefs or feelings people have about those traits, actions, or things. So, what are we seeing? Ultimately, what we are seeing is that they have to borrow from the Christian worldview. And that's where then the other part of it is, does the unbeliever take evil seriously then? So if they are taking evil very serious, they want to raise an objection against evil, then we see as it follows, unbelievers complain that certain plain facts about human experience are inconsistent with the Christian theological beliefs about the goodness and power of God. Such a complaint itself requires that non-Christian to assert the existence of evil in the world. What, however, has been presupposed here? Both the believer and unbeliever will want to insist that certain things are evil, for instance, cases of child abuse, like those already mentioned, and they will talk as though they take such moral judgments seriously, not simply as expressions of personal taste, preference, or subjective opinion. They will insist that such things are truly, objectively, intrinsically evil. Even unbelievers can be shaken from their easy and glib espousals of relativism in the face of moral atrocities like war, rape, and torture. But the question, logically speaking, is, here's the key, folks, is how the unbeliever can make sense of taking evil seriously, not simply as something inconvenient or unpleasant or contrary to his or her desires. What philosophy of value or morality can the unbeliever offer which will render it meaningful to condemn some atrocity as objectively evil? The moral indignation which is expressed by unbelievers when they encounter the wicked things which transpire in this world does not comport with the theories of ethics which unbelievers espouse, theories which prove to be arbitrary or subjective or merely utilitarian. Great, now I lost my place trying to spell out a word. Or relativistic in character. On the unbeliever's worldview, there is no good reason for saying that anything is evil in nature, but only by personal choice or feeling. So, if the person wants to be an unbeliever and consist and be saying, this is absolutely wrong, he has to borrow from the Christian worldview. Now, that being said, then the question may be, well, yeah, you may say that, but you have the burden of proof of the problem of evil at this point too. Well, indeed, it's only really there's only a problem of evil for the atheist, and it's not for the Christian. We must then prove that claim. Why is it not a problem for the Christian? So, remember the premises. God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil exists. But here's one thing that Bahnson mentions, is that if one wants to fix the alleged paradox, you have these three propositions, but what if there's a fourth proposition? And this is for the Christian. The fourth proposition is, God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil which exists. And not just for the evil that is moral, because there's in the theology and philosophy world, there is difference of evil mentioned. For example, in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, it says, and this is the words of God, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. So we see that evil is here, but when we look at the Hebrew term ra, that is being used here, I believe it's rakah in the fullness of the Hebrew term that's used in Isaiah 45:7, is referring to a natural evil like a hurricane or a earthquake or a tornado. So those kinds of things that would be considered natural evils are in existence, and God does these things. But even then, some of the things that
I would also add, on top of those three conditions, and maybe the third and a half or the fourth one you just said, I would also add that objective morality exists, and that comes from somewhere. It's not like it's like there are certain things that a believer and a non-believer can agree on, that murder is bad, right? Like that's just a fundamental thing. Now, where does that come from? Well, I don't think the atheist can say, well, like what are they going to say? Like how is murder bad? Oh, because you killed someone. Well, yeah, but why is that bad though? Yeah, I mean, Christians can answer that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We can indeed answer that, but there's the other thing. There's the disaster. There's the natural evil, and of course we can account for where good comes from. But then some people may ask, well, what about the moral evils that happen? Nothing that's a disaster of nature, but rather it's the humans that are involved. So here's one thing that's sort of goes into it, because again, keep in mind that it's about the morally sufficient reason for evil which exists, and that morally sufficient reason being something God ordains. Here's the quote from Bahnson's book and the article that's in the live chat, and I think it's very compelling, if you ask me. Think of Abraham when God ordered him to sacrifice his only son. Think of Job when he lost everything which gave his life happiness and pleasure. In each case, God had a perfectly good reason for the human misery involved. It was a mark or achievement of faith for them not to waver in their conviction of God's goodness, despite not being able to see or understand why he was doing to them what he did. Indeed, even in the case of the greatest crime in all of history, now keep in mind, this is what's going to be key here, folks. Listen very carefully to the rest of this quote. Indeed, even in the case of the greatest crime in all of history, the crucifixion of the Lord of glory, the Christian professes that God's goodness was not inconsistent with what the hands of lawless men performed. Was the killing of Christ evil? Surely. Did God have a morally sufficient reason for it? Just as surely. With Abraham we declare, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Genesis 18:25. And this goodness of God is beyond challenge. Let God be true, though all men are liars. Romans chapter 3, verse 4. And elsewhere we can see an example of this moral evil being used for good. If anyone's familiar with the story of Jacob, Jacob is, as a kid, he is sold into slavery by his brothers. And he is then he is sold as a slave to Pharaoh. And as he is sold as a slave to Pharaoh, he then becomes a prophet. He prophesies that the famine's going to happen, and Egypt needs to prepare itself so that way they can have food ready for when the famine occurs. And so that comes, and it's due to Egypt that even not just Egypt itself, but other nations survive. Then Jacob ends up meeting his brothers. And note what Jacob, a prophet of God, says. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, and make sure that this is up for our viewers. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. So the evil that was done against him, that is the evil of being sold into slavery, it was then used for good by God to bring to pass the day that they're alive, so that people could be saved and be alive from the famine because of what God has ordained to occur. So it even says that that moment that would be considered an evil act was used as a good thing by God to bring forth his purpose. And hence, the argument doesn't become a problem if the Christian grants that evil exists with an all-powerful and all-good God, but that God always has a morally sufficient reason for the evil which exists. Because again, what does that indicate? Well, if you go back to 1 Peter chapter 3, you go to verse 15, it's about giving an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you, that the reason of why you believe in this hope, why you believe in this faith, and that likewise Jude chapter 3, or Jude verse 3, since there's only one chapter of Jude, says that it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort that you should earnestly defend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. So we are to defend the faith, our faith, and not just simply ours, but the faith that was given unto all Christians, even to the saints in the beginning. So if we know our theology, if we know our beliefs, then it's quite clear that as long as we have an answer biblically why we believe this, we solve the problem at that point in the Christian worldview. And the atheist then must provide the explanation for the problem of evil at that point from their worldview. And not only this, but this can be applied to several other different worldviews, some of which may give inconsistent answers. For example, in the problem of evil for some of the Hindus and Buddhists, they believe that pain, evil, is an illusion. So if it's an illusion, then why is it that, and I'm going to go over this from the argument given by Keith Thompson from Exegetical Apologetics, who I actually used this with a Buddhist one time, and he even found and admitted, wow, there's some problems here with this religion here. But starting off with the issue of Hinduism, shall we say. Let me type in and make sure to find our spot. Okay, no, it is Buddhism that we're going for. So here's the article on moral absolutes and the laws of logic and the possibility of knowledge. In Buddhism, evil is an illusion. This contradicts valid human experience, since we all, for good reason, speak and live affirming certain things are truly evil. When on the news we hear about a brutal murder, rape, or some other heinous act, we don't say, although this seems wrong, it's just an illusion. So the Buddhist, if consistent with his own worldview, has to affirm that the murder, rape of certain things they're nothing but illusions. Morality, or evil for that matter, is an illusion. Likewise with the laws of logic, teaches that reality is an illusion itself. And if a worldview claims reality, which would include the laws of logic, then reality is just an illusion, and then the laws of logic do not exist, and therefore cannot be accounting for such a worldview, since you need a logical worldview to make sense of that. But if reality doesn't exist, the laws of logic don't exist, and therefore your statement is illogical, since it lacks logic. So there is problems within the Buddhist worldview, and for some Hindus, they may borrow from that particular idea. So that being said, we see that, the problem of evil isn't just a problem that the atheist can't answer. It's various other ones that consistently can't answer consistently the problem of evil. And what do you think is the only one that can account for it then? Well, it would be the Christian worldview. So what are your thoughts?
Oh, that definitely does seem accurate. Especially against the Buddhists. That's a very good example. Because, evil is not an illusion. There are definitely some things out there that are just objective, that they exist or that they are. So, I think this is a very good method to use, especially against arguing, different belief systems, trying to get them to understand that different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's probably one of the best ways to go out, and when you're evangelizing and witnessing to people, that you have a good method of apologetics on you. And this one helps when you're engaging in the conversations, because like I said, that's what I was using when I was engaging with that one atheist, is that I asked those questions, and those things were said, and that's how it happened. He ends up showing the absurdity of his own worldview, his own belief system, and as a result we see the flaws, the error, the problems, the whole 9 yards. So and I do want to also go over a bit of why then are we talking about this? Why are we making this a big deal? Well, here's the thing. I'm sick and tired at this point. I already had a problem enough with people just bashing other methods for the problems at this point. But if you're going to say, that it's ridiculous, but yet you're going to say these things and misrepresent badly, then obviously it's going to leave people curious to look into this stuff up and do the work and the research themselves. And sometimes when they do that and they see that you have not been honest, then they'll think less of you at that point. Because it's basically saying, well, Muslims, do this because they believe that God is a watermelon or something like that. Like there's some people that legitimately make this kind of argument, and they mostly do that because they heard one particular Muslim sheikh say that if Allah has these certain attributes, and if these attributes are true, then ultimately Allah is a watermelon, and they go with that and say, oh, that must mean that all Muslims believe Allah is a watermelon. And if people go and look this up and they see that that's wrong, then they just don't do that. And then there's even the Quran thing, which everyone was familiar with. The forget what his name was, but he was a pastor who ended up starting up an interesting controversy back then. He was from Florida, and to commemorate 9/11 was his thing. He decided to create Burn the Quran Day, where basically it was a day that people would gather their Qurans, or buy a Quran and get the thing together and then destroy and burn the Quran. And his reason,
yes, I do remember that.
And his
oh
reasoning
my goodness,
was
that was oh, nothing. I was gonna say that's actually coming up. It's supposed to be May 1st.
And so his whole thing was that we need to remove the Quran from history. We need to burn it so that no one can ever study or know what Islam was, and that it becomes forgotten in history. But the problem is that when some people wonder why would they do that, and then even when some of the people say, it doesn't matter if you burn it, the Quran will still live, and there'll be more copies made, and people ask why, and then they start looking into all these things, and they find out that originally the Quran was orally recited, and if they see that and read the books that mention about Islam, at least in a historical perspective, about this recitation and memorization, then they start saying, maybe Islam is true, and maybe we got to convert. And it's because of that you're not allowing people to then see some of these materials, because you're saying burn the materials. And in this case, people are demonizing presuppositional apologetics and saying, don't look into this method, don't look into this stuff. We'll tell you what we think it is, and we won't even go to the source material. We won't even quote Van Til. We won't even go into what Bahnson said or go quote a book from the actual sources. It's pretty much problematic on of itself. And so this is why there was even the debate between that pastor and David Wood. I'm sure you might know who David Wood is, Ave.
David Wood. It does sound familiar, I'm sure.
Acts 17.
Yeah, I'm sure I do.
Acts 17 Apologetics.
Oh, okay.
Let me see. Okay.
Yeah, I still don't know. But that's okay.
He's basically a popular YouTuber who goes around refuting Islam. But they had a debate a while back on should we burn the Quran, and he was saying that we shouldn't. And I would agree, of course, with David Wood on that, because we need to know the sources and not give any misrepresentations. And we need to, by knowing the sources, we can then engage with the Muslims.
Exactly.
And that's ultimately the thing is with what even Gregg Bahnson states, that you don't just, sure, you do need to study your own theology. You do need to study what you believe. But at the same time, you also need to find out that as you believe this, you also need to, as you believe what you believe, and here's the reason why I mentioned this, and we've already played enough videos as it is, but there's a video that inspired me a little bit to kind of reflect it upon myself, and that is there's a Muslim named Dawa Man, or Imran Mansur, and I posted this video of him on my channel where and it got 100 dislikes by some Muslims who didn't like what he said because he called him out on this whole thing. But like, listen what he says here and how we should apply this in our lives.
There's one guy who just talks absolute trash.
Yeah.
I'm saying certain man
wow,
are doing videos with this guy. Okay, like there's one like Far East Asian don, and this guy just he doesn't have he just shouts and insults Islam. I'm saying this is not a guy that you can ever have a real conversation with. But from when you do an interview with him and put it on your channel, it's just because he was trending in the park, and you only doing that because okay, let me chat to the guy who's trending. Like these guys, wallah, they're such donuts, man. Like, I remember people in Hyde Park were not famous. The only ones who were famous or known were the Muslim du'at who used to go there. So as a Muslim there, you shouldn't give your platform to people who are unknown, because you're gonna make them famous, and then they're gonna get a platform to speak, and they're gonna drive people away from the deen. And not only that, I see people like wallahi who calling people out for debates and losing miserably. So it's embarrassing, and you don't realize that you're actually harming the hearts of these people. So when I see people doing this and they're doing it wrong, it burns me. As in, I want to cry, like, as in, because I love this da'wah.
Yeah.
I love speaking to atheists. I love speaking to Christians. I love speaking to the secularists. And I know how to speak to them. But the reason I stopped...
You kind of jumped out of that field for a while. Because I remember, I'm sure most people do as well. You had those videos where you speak to people. Like the Lawrence Krauss thing was just one from many. Like you would, for example, he spoke to that. That's what I'm saying. It's not. It's literally a throw. Like what's the word? It's a red herring or something to that effect. But I remember, like for example, you spoke to that Sikh guy. You spoke to that Christian Pakistani guy.
Sikh guy thing's a bit different. Sikh guy thing was not really a debate.
I didn't say debate. I'm just saying you had a conversation with him, and you had a conversation.
Fast forward a bit.
Really, truly, actually, man, like, okay, I'll tell you something.
Go on.
This is something that one Jehovah's Witness guy said to me. He said this to me: hey, what you've told me is that my Bible is wrong, but you haven't told me why your Quran is right. And he was like, and he was, and he goes, in this discussion, you've used my Bible more than your Quran. Like, as in, you're still dependent on my book.
Wow.
And he was like, it was powerful because every time I speak to him about Islam, he'd pull out a verse from the Bible and try to respond from the Bible.
Yeah. Which means he knew about his book.
He knew about his book.
Right.
And then, shall I tell you something deep?
Go on.
For a long time I was giving da'wah. I knew more Bible verses than Quran verses.
Wow.
And shall I tell you something else? The majority of your brothers in Hyde Park take no more Bible verses than no Quran verses.
Wow.
Don't let it fool you.
So, the problem in this is where he said he decided to stop doing dawah, which is Islamic evangelism. He decided to stop doing that because when he was dealing with the Jehovah's Witness, at least, though we would say they don't fully know the Bible because they get false theology, but at least the Jehovah's Witness knew a lot of Bible verses and could try to defend their ideas versus a Muslim who didn't know much about his Quran. And that's usually where the non-Christian can be seen as weak at some point, not just simply the atheist, but also the the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist. If you not just know your scriptures, you can defend any objections raised against you, but if you can know a bit about the sources of your opponent to formulate an argument or to raise an objection and to stick on that point, you can show the absurdity being reduced of your opponent, and then as a result of your opponent's absurdity, with his worldview, you demonstrate the Christian worldview to be consistent and true. Then, unless your opponent can try to solve the problems that are causing his worldview to sink, he has no point, or he has no option but to accept Christianity, or to just simply remain appearing as an inconsistent fool who thinks he is wise, but in reality, his ideas are nothing but like saying that a green rock is blue. Doesn't make sense. If the rock is green, why are you calling it a blue rock to begin with? So that's where things start to become problematic, and this is why Christians, if you're going to do apologetics, because a lot of people, when they're doing apologetics, they're just quoting from some of their favorite apologists. Like, that's all you really get these days. And it doesn't make sense to me, because even sometimes in the Reformed community, I can see this happening. Like, there are some people that are so much in the Reformed side of things, and we would call these the hyper-Calvinists, that they would, go out and they would start quoting just John Calvin, James White, all these things. They would just start quoting these people. But they didn't spend much time about quoting the Bible. They didn't have much care for knowing what does the Bible say on this matter. Well, you say, where do you find the doctrine of election in the Bible? Well, James White says, no, want to know what the Bible says. They want to know something, like, it's like, like how that song goes, I want to know what love is. Want you to show me. You see, they want to know what love is, and they want it to be shown to them. So why can't it be? If they want to know what the Bible is, why don't you follow the second part of the request and show it to them? Like, they want to know this stuff. They don't want to know what James White says. Now, I'm not saying don't read some of these people. These people can be helpful, but notice even then, they are quoting the Bible. And they're doing this so that you can know where they get the information from. For example, here, I have a book right here, What is Reformed Theology by R.C. Sproul. If you want to defend, the ideas and the beliefs of, Calvinism from here, there's Bible verses. Like right here, it mentions humans' radical corruption. There's a section on here, and it says, Psalm 14, verse 1. Psalm 14, 1 through 3, Psalm 53, verse 1 through 3, where it says, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is not one who understands. There is not one who seeks after God. They have all gone out of the way. They have gone, or they have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. So some people be like, where does the Bible teach about man's fallen nature and the depravity of the human being? People can say, well, R.C. Sproul said in the book, What is Reformed Theology? Or you just start quoting Psalm 14. Or you go to Psalm 53. Or you go to Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, which are quoting those passages. So, like, there are times where, sure, if you want to go into scholarly things that expound upon a text more, sure. But you go to the Bible most of all and first of all. And then if you need to explain it, then sure, you can mention these scholarly things, and then you're doing expository preaching or expository giving of a message of the text. And so there is nothing wrong. And here's the other objection that's usually raised, is that people say, well, in the whole thing here, presuppositionalism doesn't believe in evidences because it attacks evidentialism and all these other things. Well, there's two things to that. Number one comes from, and we're going to be quoting some Bahnson here. Doesn't mean, again, we're viewing him as divinely inspired. But I want you to focus on what even he notes, because what he does is interesting, is that he refutes the people who are trying to say that presuppositionalism rejects evidence, because they basically don't go to outside sources or evidence. We only want the Bible and nothing else. But there are two articles: the impropriety of evidentially arguing for the resurrection and evidential apologetics the right way. So, according to, and I was actually talking to someone earlier about this, because someone was saying if you can prove that Jesus rose from the dead, then you solve the problem of evil. Now, you and me both know, Abe, that it's kind of bad to hear the problem of evil. But
yeah.
But to me, I think it's also as bad to hear that if you can somehow prove that the resurrection, that all you care about is just defending the resurrection, then somehow that automatically defends every other single belief idea that you have. Like saying, if the resurrection is true, then the conclusion is God's not evil.
What? No, what?
Yeah, that's
Wait,
that's
no.
That's just one Christian's argument, is that if the resurrection happened, then that follows that God's not evil, and thus there is no problem of evil.
God was never evil. That doesn't. Ah, my brain.
I know. So here's what Gregg Bahnson says in the essay. And I'm going to go ahead and put this article out for our viewing audience. But it says, the fact that Christ rose from the dead does not prove anything within the neutral framework of an evidentialist's argument. Christ's resurrection does not entail his deity, just as our future resurrection, which the Bible does say that we will be resurrected in heaven on the last days, just as our future resurrection does not entail our divinity. And
oh, wait a minute. What? Yes, it absolutely does.
Well, talking about not entail our
Jesus, at least.
Well, Jesus, but the issue is that just because then Christ resurrected doesn't mean that therefore he's deity, just in the same way that us being resurrected, because we are going to be resurrected, that doesn't mean that we're divine, that we're God. And so, and then it But listen. And one could not argue the first person to rise from the dead is God, for on that basis, Lazarus, because remember, before Jesus died and then rose, who was one person that rose according to the Gospels? Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
So should that mean that Lazarus is God? Because if people say that Christ is God, then we should say Lazarus is God, because Lazarus had a resurrection. And not only that, but that Lazarus resurrected before Jesus. And so Bahnson goes on to say, the evidentialist may prove the resurrection of Jesus, but until he proves every other point of Christianity, then resurrection is an isolated, irrelevant, brute fact which is no aid to our apologetical efforts. Only within the system of Christian logic does the resurrection of Christ have the meaning and implication, and that system of logic, entailment, and premises can only be used on a presuppositional basis, that you do not argue into it. In terms of the evidentialist's approach to the unbeliever, that skeptic can accept the resurrection, which I've heard some people do. They say this, that the skeptic can accept the resurrection without flinching, for the resurrection is simply a random fact until a Christian foundation has been placed under it. Furthermore, in the past, men like Ramirez and Paulus have utilized the same enlightened scientific methodology as that of evidentialism and have concluded that Christ could not have rose from the dead. It is terribly unwise for the Christian to stake his apologetic, meaning ultimately his apologetic stems on this, the shifting sands of, quote, scientific scholarship. In other words, naturalistic, atheistic forms of scholarship. So in other words, when utilizing the presuppositions of the atheist to defend Christianity, you're not going to be able to ultimately defend it and justify it. But as he states himself, if we accept that Scripture is what it says, and accept what the Scriptures say as true, while affirming the supernatural worldview of Christianity, which means we believe in miracles, we believe that this can account for exceptions within the violations of the laws of nature, that we have no problem here. But the atheist will have a problem with this, and not just in this particular instance, but elsewhere. So they don't deny the usage of evidence, but there's the fact that we must recognize that there is actual evidence as well as an actual presupposition that one has that allows them to interpret the evidence differently. Like, we can look at creation, we can see, like if we were to go out and look at the trees or look at the sky and say, did this bring itself about? Was it brought about by naturalistic, materialistic processes? According to the atheist, they say, yeah, it was brought about naturalistically without guidance. The Christian looks at the clouds and says, this was brought about by the Lord God who created all things. So we have these presuppositions that cause us to interpret the evidence differently. So the main thing that needs to be going after is the presupposition that the atheist may have, and show how in their observation of this it is absurd. For example, how can the atheist trust and know that his senses are reliable without having their own presuppositional or circular or vicious circular argumentation? Now, we could probably say the same thing about us, but ultimately we also have another solution, and that is that God grants us our sight, created us with sight, and because God exists and because he is faithful and to his creation in the sense of giving them life and giving them common grace, then we can definitely trust that it's reliable. But also there has to be the explanation of how these things came about. And again, ultimately, this is why even evolution can only make sense logically from a Christian perspective and not an atheistic one. But as Bahnson says in the other article, Evidential Apologetics the Right Way, the presuppositional use of evidence in apologetics recognizes that ultimately the intellectual conflict between believers and unbelievers is a matter of antithetical worldviews. We must show that the unbeliever's worldview, by which he wishes to oppose the claims of the faith, would not only preclude the facts of Scripture, but the very intelligibility of any facts about any subject whatsoever. So not only do we show the evidences, but that for him to even accept that the evidence would be true for his idea presupposes that the Christian worldview is true to some degree. In other words, he's borrowing from Christianity. So, and I say that Zachary, who's contributing to the upcoming Apologetic Quarterly that's going to be coming up next month, says I guess the article on the resurrection was half baked, and it wasn't necessarily half baked. So it's pretty much like I said. I'm not going to try to harsh on it because I already had a problem with, Cam of Zachary's capability is weak. Therefore, the people of others' ability is weak in apologetic just because they use a different method. Also, what's up, Remy? It has been a long time. It's been several years since, especially the old Ask RC Apologists show, and he still has the Green Lantern icon, folks. Oh man, going down a bit of memory lane here. But yes, so just because we have the issue here about, certain ideas of, apologetic methodology being different, I don't know why that means we have to be into a fight about it. We don't have to. We can simply accept that, we have our methods, but keep in mind at the same time, don't misrepresent what presuppositionalism is, because it's at that reason why I decided to do the research myself and why I've now come to the conclusion of it. And I do certainly see it as true. Because at this point, you look into it and you get all this stuff said and done. And you look into all these research and the definitions, and it actually makes a lot of sense. And hence why this is actually going to be interesting for the upcoming debate that I'm going to be trying to get arranged with Skylar Fiction on the problem of evil. So I will be certainly getting that set up at some point. So yeah, wish me luck, by the way, whenever that happens. So, ow, my tooth. But anyways. Yeah, so like let's go ahead and get your opinion on this, because you haven't said too much, Ave, and I want to get your opinion on the articles that you've had a chance to read. From what you have read, that was the presuppositional procedure, and then another article on the matter. What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, it reminds me a lot of like a lens. You know, like there's a certain way of looking at the world. I guess maybe I'm summarizing it. I thought it was very interesting, and now that you mention it, it really does seem like that's kind of what we're always doing, like from the start. Like you'd always just go back to the Bible, and try to be consistent about that. And well, I also liked transdentals. How the hell do you say it?
Yeah, transcendental.
Transcendentals, yeah, whatever. The whole idea of that, actually, of finding like the root, but like, I guess like it transcends. It's a very difficult concept to like really get your to wrap your mind around. I tried reading both articles, and there's a lot of quite a lot of detail in them. So I'm still thinking about it. It's something I want to do some more research in.
Oh yeah.
But I like the idea that an atheist and a believer can see the same evidence and yet have different perspectives on it, even though, yeah. So like I said, I'm gonna have to go into that. I do also like the idea of one idea that branches out and it affects your perspective or your morals on other things as well, and that really does explain quite a lot, actually, about how people think and how we view the world. So I thought that was some very interesting perspective from that.
Yeah. And Remy is trying to pronounce transcendental in a different, interesting way, or he says transcendental.
Yeah, I don't know.
50 points off of you, Remy, for misspelling. You little troublemaker. Anyways, so. But yeah, so we'll take 30. We got about 30 minutes left. So if anyone's got questions that they want to ask in the live chat, feel free to do so regarding anything that may have questions about presuppositional apologetics, because we want to make sure that we get all these questions answered as to why I'm definitely going to be leaning more down that route. Why is it that I think other people should go down this route? Because again, I'm not bashing or saying people must forsake their other different methods, but I do at the same time recommend other people at least give it a try. Like for example, here's where I would get a good interesting look into it. There's several bookstores that are online or of the sort that can give you access to some of this stuff. Like I forgot how it was that I got the book Always Ready, and I had it in the PDF form too. But there's I know the website that's mostly where the links of these articles are coming from, the Covenant Media Foundation. They have a PDF or a ebook of Always Ready, but even then you can find that other places. But in the American Vision website, which is where I'm starting to get to looking into most of these things, there's Gregg Bahnsen's Pushing the Antithesis, the apologetic methodology of Gregg L. Bahnsen, which I believe is a written record of his transcripts of lectures he gave at a apologetic conference, and it includes the lecture and those things. And then there was a book that was posted or that was published after his death, and it was called Presuppositional. I think this is the best one here. It's called Presuppositional Apologetics, Stated and Defended. Both of these of which are $10 if you get a PDF, or even if you're wanting a Kindle or EPUB. So either way, you have a chance to get it. But the last book that I mentioned, Presuppositional Apologetics, Stated and Defended, is essentially trying to say, okay, we're going to defend or Bahnson says he's going to defend and explain why it is people need to use presuppositional apologetics, and also address misconceptions and falsehoods that are addressed against, or accusations made. Because there's even people today, like Mike Winger and Capturing Christianity, that say, hey, you know what? This is wrong. There's a reason we must reject presuppositional apologetics. But then you have, you know, Bahnson, who has already addressed some of these, and he's, again, not the only one. There were several people that wrote down their material defending and giving the reason and justification for why it is that they affirm what they affirm. And in fact, let me see, to go over some of the if it'll even do it, because I know sometimes Amazon will have that option to give you to look over a little preview, but then again, you may not know if that's always the case. So let me see if I can find. I guess not, because ultimately, if you can find good justification for the defense of, you know, certain ideas, then those are good. And it's not, and even then, Bahnson isn't the, because, you know, Bahnsen's dead and all that, sure, but then you have other people. K. Scott Oliphant, who writes Covenantal Apologetics, which is essentially, you know, its own thing. It's explaining presuppositional apologetics, but with more modern language that's easy to understand. Dolos Theology asks a question in the live chat. Can you comment on how our theological anthropology factors in our apologetic methodology? Okay, there's a plate full right there. So yes, how our biblical, or not well, I mean, it is biblical, but a theological anthropology, and just so some people can understand what we are referring to in the anthropology here. I'm pretty sure some people can get an idea of anthropology from at least the first part of anthro.
Yeah, just think of me.
There you go. But a Christian anthropology refers to the study of the human as it relates to God. So the anthropology in Christianity, the Christian anthropology, is about the study of the human being as it relates to God. And if that's the case, on what that means, how does the theological anthropology factor into the apologetic methodology? And of course, this is actually an interesting point where we also see the difference between the different methods. In other different apologetic methods, it has the idea that man is completely autonomous, that his will is completely free and is independent of God, to the point that he can do certain things without that. And so we have this notion of man. But then if you have the presuppositional notion that focuses on and emphasizes that, well, now we're going to actually include the theology of the Bible involved, where it says that, you know, what we stated earlier in Psalm 14, Psalm 53, and Romans chapter 3, that there is the issue of human beings that when they're unbelievers, they have that wicked heart, they have that unregenerate heart, they do not desire God, they only desire their sin. And then the Christian, who has the desire to please God and to strive for holiness, what does that tell you? It tells you that there's a difference between the believer and the non-believer, and therefore there's going to be a difference in the presupposition, and there's must be a way of how we should then interact with the non-believer, and realize that if we take what the Bible says about how then the nature of the human being can be changed, we know that that's through the gospel. And when we spread the gospel's message, remember the Bible says to preach the word, and when we give him the word of the gospel, then therefore that can affect him. Hence why we don't drop the Bible or ignore the Bible when we go out and do apologetics. We maintain that, and that's why I do it. Every time that I'm in a debate, I always make sure to give the gospel presentation, because that might not just affect my opponent, but other people that are listening. That's the purpose of why we do these things, and not just the mere apologetics of debate, but even when we go out street preaching, I'll engage in apologetics with people, so that when defending the Bible, I always make sure that part of my response includes the gospel message, and about how our anthropology is, that how the view of human beings is viewed in light of what the Bible says, and that ultimately affects our apologetic method in reaching to the believer or reaching to the unbeliever, answering their objections, so that the worldview is reduced to absurdity, show the consistency of Christianity, show that therefore God, has done these things, including Jesus Christ being crucified, and so that through the blood that was shed, you may be redeemed of your sins. And now you just have to accept and put your faith and trust in Christ. So we have these ideas, and it can affect your methodology very efficiently, because some people are just into philosophical debates and getting into Christian apologetics for the sake of debate, and not about trying to convert the person through the means of the gospel, because they have a different view of anthropology at that point. So what's up, Samuel Reyes? We see you in the chat. Okay. Making sure as well to go over some of the things here. I want to make sure I'm covering some of the basis here on these different chats. We got about 20 minutes. We may shut it early if we don't have any more questions. But any more comments you'd like to mention, Ave?
Yeah. I forgot to mention this before, but it might be a few days late. But yeah, Happy Easter.
Oh, indeed. Happy Easter. Happy
yeah,
Easter.
that happened.
Oh, yeah. And we will do one thing. Oh, wait. All right, let's answer this question first, and then we'll get into the announcement for next week's episode. Zachary Colley asks, how can we apply this approach to people that accuse God of murder and other violations of the non-aggression principle? Okay, so accuse God of murder and other violations of the non-aggression principle. For those of you who may not know what that principle is, let's go ahead and pull this up. Wow, there's even a website that's called the non-aggression principle. I'm gonna go with that if they're that dedicated to the thing. According to the website Non-Aggression Principle, it says the non-aggression principle, or NAP, is the belief that individuals should be free to act as they choose, with the exception that they may not initiate force or the threat of force against another person or their property. So in other words, that if God is being accused of doing murder and then violating this idea of acting freely without initiating force or threat of force against another person or their property. Here's the thing. If we go over that, then we are God's creation. We all then at that point rightly belong to God. And therefore, with the issue of people saying that's murder, people say, well, the issue is murder is a premeditated sinful killing, meaning that is unjust and undeserved. So by that point you have to ask, then what is the standard for saying that something is deserved or not deserved of death? Again, we reach to the issue of what was the problem of evil for the atheist. He must give an issue about, he must try to give an explanation for why it is that this is wrong to kill him in this way, or why it was unjust for him to do so. Then also there's the issue of, you go to Romans 9, and I'm going to pull this up on the screen for our audience. But this also went into the whole thing, and we're going to get into the other judgment passages, by the way. So it says, thou wilt say unto me, why does he yet find fault? For who has resisted his will? Nay, but, oh man, who are you that replies against God? Shall the thing created say to him that formed it, him that created you, Why hast thou made me thus? Has not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he had afore prepared to glory? So God is saying God has the right to do so. Who are you, the mere man, to make these objections? God has the right to be God. And then you have the issue of, well, why then did he cause the flood? Why then was he ordering the Amalekites to be killed? The issue is that they sinned and broke God's law to the point that it was a grievous problem. They were sacrificing babies and promoting idolatry in the land of the Amalekites and the Canaanites. There was, according to the Bible regarding the flood, there was sinfulness all around on the earth. And that's when it's like, okay, we got to take care of this. And so sends the flood, but tells Noah, of course, to build the ark. But point is, judgment is being sent for a purpose. There wasn't murder because there was a reason for it. Then he has the right to do so because he is God. We are his creation, and he is able to do as he pleases with his creation. That is the argument. So, let's see. Let me see if there's an... Oh, so Samuel's asking, when am I going to do another anime parable? I have no idea. I'm starting to think that if I can, we already have panels set at this point, but saying that, I might do an actual lecture or PowerPoint presentation at an anime convention of anime parables. So that's very possible in the future. Darth Calculus says, hey RC, early on you talked about wrong being either objective or subjective, but this ignores a variety of what is meant by wrong. The precept assumes a definition his opponent may not share, and that's why if the opponent has a different idea, then he should explain it. But that's why I would ask, is this right or wrong? Is it objective or subjective? And if they say that it's subjective, then they will say, okay, I accept. Though if that's the case, I accept that. So they say it's objective, I have to accept that definition. That's what I do. I ask that, which is the same thing I did with the atheist when asking him, is right or wrong subjective or objective? And he said it is subjective. So he knew what he was talking about, and I accept that definition with him. But if someone says it's objective, then that's where we get into problems. Because then I have to find, okay, when you say it's wrong and it's objective, what is the standard for it being objective? So, all right, I want to get this off the before another question gets sent in the chat. Tune in next week, folks, where we will be talking with a certain historian. Y'all might be familiar with some of her work, and we're going to be having her on to discuss it in a fashion that she's only done it once on the Patrick Coffin show. That's right, folks. If you're familiar with the name Rachel Fulton Brown, then you're probably going to be excited for who we're talking to, because thanks to Ave and his powerful skills of persuasion and investigation, he has managed to get us an interview arranged with Rachel Fulton Brown herself, the person who's written a lot of works on the topic of mostly a focus on the medieval period regarding the views of Mary in how she is depicted in artwork, and in fact to kind of go over the list of some of the books she's written, from Judgment to Passion. Let's see, Mary and the Art of Prayer, the Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought. So we're going to be talking with the author of these books, as that's her study, and we're going to get into some very interesting conversations. I can guarantee you, first of all, it's probably going to get a little spicy for some people, because I remember there's some guys that are a fan of hers, and they certainly ain't a fan of me. So the live chat may be heated, and I haven't talked to Dr. Brown herself yet, so we don't know if she'll take things the wrong way or the right way. We'll just see how everything turns out, because I do know she did have a discussion and a dialogue with, I think, Skylar Fiction a while back, so we can hopefully see if she's able to endure that, then I'm pretty sure she's able to endure with me, the Protestant, that's against some of the doctrines of Mary. So we'll see.
It's not a debate. It's a theological discussion.
Right,
you know.
but you know that how sometimes those discussions get, like, remember the thing with Jonathan Sheffield about the text of the New Testament at one point. That got heated.
Yeah.
So, okay, so an unrelated question of the topic, but Alexandre Matkaliuk, however you pronounce it. Do you believe that the Bible is compatible with evolutionary origin? To some degree, I don't believe the Bible teaches evolution, but I do believe that a Christian can affirm evolution. I'll just say that much. I'll affirm the statement of the Princeton theologian B.B. Warfield before it was taken over by liberalism, and that is, I do not think that there is any general statement in the Bible or any part of the account of creation, either as given in Genesis 1 and 2, elsewhere alluded to, that need to be opposed to evolution. So I would go with that. Alright, so folks, my back. I try to pop and crack it, and sometimes I get the thing where it hurts. I'm hurt, Ave. You gotta help me. Anyways, I'm just gonna be crazy.
Just a little bonkers.
Oh, yeah, at least you admit it. Oh, this is interesting. I gotta read this at some point, but yes, so that's all we're gonna have time for the show, folks. So I want to thank y'all for tuning on in. I'm gonna make sure to get that music ready. And of course, so yeah. I can't even talk right today. So, Ave, any last words or thoughts you want to have shared out about tonight's topic?
Well, just going back to what I said before, I'm definitely gonna look into it. Can really offer some good methodology. Yeah, it's pretty new to me, but it's something that just kind of makes sense, I guess. So yeah, I'm gonna have to look into it. And for all those listening, I hope you had a wonderful time, and we shall see you next week.
Indeed, indeed. Alright, so while Ave is muted as we go out with the outro, let me make sure to get this music going as well. Folks, just keep in mind that, we're not bashing any methods here, like some people, unfortunately. But we also want to make sure that, we're getting the information out to show why we're affirming this, and if some people do want to get into it, we give good reasons for putting on and adopting this methodology of apologetics. That being said as well, folks, I do want to take the time to, thank y'all for tuning in and everything, but please be safe as well, because, we're in a time where, COVID-19 is becoming a problem thing. We got cases increasing, Kenneth Copeland's being crazy as usual, but besides all of that, we have to remember that, again, God is with us. God is with his church. And there's an interesting thing I saw on Facebook, I believe. It was that, Paul felt pain from being stung by a snake, and that he still felt the pain even afterwards, but he didn't die from it. So just because you might go through some troubles doesn't mean that therefore you're going to be immune to pain. Sometimes you're going to experience pain physically, mentally, spiritually, but you will survive. God has made sure that what you have is sufficient for you to carry on. So be there for each other. Call your folks. Let them know how you're doing, that you love them. Same with your friends. With that being said, thank y'all for tuning in. We're gonna be muted as this outro plays out. So till then, this has been RC Apologist, and we will see you next week with Rachel Fulton Brown on the show. Till then, take care.